From childhood, almost everyone has been captivated by a tale that stands as a stark example of masterful deception. The narrative recounts how the Greeks, having constructed a colossal wooden horse, left it before the walls of an impenetrable city and feigned a retreat. Blinded by their perceived victory and mistaking the peculiar structure for a divine offering, the Trojans hauled it inside their city walls. That very night, the warriors concealed within opened the gates to their waiting army, and the mighty city fell, a scene forever etched into the annals of military deception. This narrative, immortalized across children's books, school curricula, and both ancient and modern literature, has become deeply embedded in our collective consciousness. Even without knowing every detail, one can effortlessly conjure the key images: bronze-clad heroes, the doomed city, the radiant beauty of Helen, and Achilles, forever enshrined in immortal glory. The very legends of the Trojan War themselves stretch back into the mists of deep antiquity to an era known as the Late Bronze Age. The historical time frame commonly associated with these legendary events points to the late 13th century, before the Common Era. It was then, according to later tradition, that alliances of peoples from mainland Greece, known as the Achaeans, mounted a monumental naval expedition to the western coast of Asia Minor. Their ultimate destination was a formidable and heavily fortified city, which in ancient Greek texts most frequently appears under the name Ilion. The name Ilion, extensively used in Homeric poetry and other epics, is one of the many designations for the legendary city of Troy. The city itself was situated in the northwestern part of Asia Minor, within the historical region ancient authors referred to as the Troad. Today, this region falls within modern-day Turkey, bordering the strategically vital Dardanelles Strait, a waterway that links the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea via the Sea of Marmara. This geographic location endowed the city with immense significance. Command over this narrow sea corridor offered the key to controlling a substantial portion of the era's international trade and crucial maritime routes, along which a constant stream of merchant caravans and vessels passed. The narrative of the Trojan War blossomed into the central, foundational myth of all ancient Greek civilization. Initially existing solely in oral tradition, it was passed down from one generation of bards to the next, slowly accumulating greater detail and embellishment. Later, these scattered songs coalesced into the great epic poems, which became not merely literary monuments, but indispensable sources for comprehending Greek culture. This epic tradition shaped not only art itself, but also the very way of contemplating the past, where historical memory and mythological consciousness were inextricably fused into a single, seamless whole. Around this narrative, an enduring set of beliefs about heroism, martial duty, the pursuit of glory, and the devastating cost of conflict coalesced, cementing the Trojan War as an integral component of the European cultural matrix. Yet, the account that has reached us through the prism of high poetry is more than mere literary invention. There is a strong possibility that it harbors echoes of genuine historical events. For over 2 centuries, the keen minds of historians, archaeologists, and philologists have grappled with this enigma, striving to separate the grains of historical truth from the chaff of poetic exaggeration, and to discern what reality truly lies hidden behind the immortal lines of ancient epic. The story of the Trojan War emerges before us as a complex cultural stratum, forged by centuries of oral tradition, epic poetry, and subsequent literary refinement. The primary and most influential source, without a doubt, remains the epic poem, the Iliad, whose authorship is attributed to Homer. It was this work that established the canonical image of the war, its key participants, and its dramatic events. However, the poem's content, contrary to popular misconception, is not a chronicle of the entire 10-year siege. Instead, it encompasses only a brief yet pivotal episode from the conflict's final year, focusing on Achilles' destructive quarrel with King Agamemnon, the death of his friend Patroclus and his furious duel with Troy's defender, Hector. Despite such narrow temporal confines, the Iliad's text contains a cultural construct of astonishing power. Through the characters' dialogues and actions, through detailed descriptions of armor, burial rites, and military customs, it reveals not merely a plot, but a holistic worldview of the ancient person, with their concepts of valor, honor, fate, and divine intervention. The poem did not spring forth as the momentary flash of genius from one individual, but rather as the result of a prolonged, multi-century evolution of oral tradition. The very events that formed its basis are dated to the late 13th century before the Common Era, while the Iliad was only written down in the 8th century before the Common Era, nearly 5 centuries later. During all this time, the tales of heroes lived on as songs, performed by wandering bards and rhapsodes. The very style and structure of the poem unequivocally indicate that its text was repeatedly revised and polished in the minds and on the tongues of countless storytellers. Thus, the ever-changing oral tradition crystallized into the monumental lines of the epic, forever shaping our perception of that war. But what if this canonical text is merely one among many versions, and the others, perhaps closer to the truth, were forever buried in its shadow? Within the Iliad's text, elements from vastly different historical periods, from the late Bronze Age to the Archaic era, are curiously intertwined. Archaeologists and historians continually discover details in the poem characteristic of various cultural layers, creating a complex mosaic of anachronisms. For instance, descriptions of certain helmet types, the technology for constructing fortress walls, battle tactics, and even sacrificial rituals to the gods often belong to later traditions than the presumed time of the Trojan War. All of this serves as compelling evidence that we are not dealing with a direct recording of an ancient chronicle, but rather a literary fixation of a deeply rooted myth, one that crystallized over centuries. For this reason, the Iliad cannot be considered an absolutely reliable historical document. It reflects not so much the factual content of events as the ancient Greeks' own perceptions of their heroic past. Beyond the Iliad, other epic works existed, collectively known as the epic cycle or the Trojan cycle. This was a vast compilation of poems that meticulously detailed various phases of the Trojan War. Some recounted the events preceding the conflict, others the actual fall of the great city, and still others the long and tragic return of the surviving heroes to their homelands. The most renowned among these included the Cypria, the Aethiopis, the Little Iliad, and the Sack of Ilion. All of these texts were composed in the 7th or 6th centuries before the Common Era. However, they have survived into our time only as sparse fragments or brief summaries by later ancient authors. Nevertheless, thanks to these tantalizing glimpses, we can reconstruct the overall structure of the mythological narrative, which in antiquity was perceived as a cohesive, if not always perfectly consistent, tapestry of the past. The fascination with the Trojan War's events did not wane during the era of classical Greece. In the 5th century, before the Common Era, these narratives were actively explored by the great dramatists, notably Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Each of them reinterpreted the canonical images and motifs of the ancient epic in their own distinct way, imbuing them with new meaning reflective of their era. For instance, in Euripides' works, heroes navigate an atmosphere of agonizing tragic choices and profound psychological anguish, while the war itself becomes merely a backdrop for philosophical reflections on the nature of fate, justice, and human suffering. During the Roman era, this theme experienced a monumental resurgence. The most significant work was Virgil's Aeneid, composed in the 1st century before the Common Era. In this epic poem, the Trojan hero Aeneas, having fled the burning city, becomes the progenitor of the great Roman people. Here, the mythological plot is employed with a distinctly political agenda. Through Aeneas's destiny, the Romans forged their lineage to a legendary heroic past, legitimizing their own power and imperial ambitions. For many centuries, the Trojan War was regarded as nothing more than a beautiful myth. Although Homer depicted the events with astonishing vividness and detail, until the 19th century, European scholars and thinkers treated these accounts as pure literary convention. Neither the exact location of the legendary Troy nor any material traces of it were known to science. Everything changed in the mid-19th century when one man dared to believe that a genuine history lay hidden behind the lines of lofty poetry. This man was Heinrich Schliemann, a German merchant who, from a young age, was passionately enamored with ancient Greek culture. After reading the Iliad in his youth, he retained a lifelong, unwavering conviction that the city described in the poem truly existed. Despite his complete lack of formal archaeological training, Schliemann dedicated his life and fortune to the search for the city immortalized by Homer. He was convinced that by meticulously adhering to the geographical clues embedded within the poem's text, he could uncover the actual sites that served as its foundation. In 1870, Schliemann commenced extensive excavations on Hisarlik Hill, situated in the northwestern part of Asia Minor, within the historical boundaries of ancient Troad. He drew upon the landmarks described in the Iliad, its proximity to the strait, the flat plains, and mentions of two rivers. In his very first seasons, his endeavors bore fruit. He unearthed the remains of massive fortress defenses, numerous layers of destruction, and distinct cultural horizons, clearly belonging to different eras. These findings irrefutably confirmed that an ancient and powerful settlement had indeed existed on this hill, one that was repeatedly destroyed and resurrected from its ashes. However, Schliemann's initial excavations, for all their significance, were exceedingly destructive. Lacking mastery of scientific stratigraphic methods, the layer-by-layer study of cultural deposits, he often ruthlessly cut through later strata in his impatient quest to reach the most ancient, Homeric Troy. His primary interest was concentrated on spectacular finds, which he passionately believed could have belonged to the epic's heroes. His most famous discovery was the so-called Treasure of Priam, an impressive collection of gold jewelry, vessels, and other artifacts which Schliemann hastily declared to be the treasures of the legendary Trojan king. It was only later discovered that these magnificent artifacts dated to a much earlier period, approximately the middle of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, meaning they were crafted over 1,000 years before the presumed Trojan War. Despite his numerous errors and destructive methods, Schliemann achieved the most crucial feat. He proved to the world that the ruins of a great ancient city truly lay hidden beneath Hisarlik Hill, and not merely the product of poetic imagination. Subsequently, the excavations were continued by professional archaeologists, among whom Wilhelm Dörpfeld played a particularly pivotal role. This German engineer and researcher applied a systematic scientific approach and stratigraphic analysis to the study of Troy, which for the first time allowed for the clear identification of the structure and chronology of the cities that successively occupied the site. Modern archaeology identifies not one city on Hisarlik Hill, but an entire sequence of multiple settlements spanning the period from the Neolithic Age to the Roman era. Thus, thanks to the audacity of one dreamer, the myth began to take on flesh and blood. But every newly unearthed layer of earth only added fresh questions to the ancient legend. It's widely accepted that the primary contenders for the site of legendary Troy are the archaeological layers designated as Troy 6 and Troy 7. The settlement known as Troy 6, flourishing from approximately the 18th to the 13th century BCE, was a large, superbly fortified city, boasting massive stone walls and monumental architecture. Culturally, it exhibited clear affinities with Mycenaean Greece and bore witness to a high degree of urban organization. Crucially, however, this city met its demise not at the hands of an enemy, but as a result of a powerful earthquake, the traces of which are clearly discernible. The subsequent layer, Troy 7, dating from the 13th to the late 12th century BCE, bears unmistakable hallmarks of violent destruction brought about by fire and warfare. Within the ruins of homes from this period, archaeologists unearthed human remains, shattered weaponry, and collapsed walls, all of which for a long time were considered the most compelling evidence that this particular city was destroyed in war. Archaeologists also note that Troy 7 was inhabited by the same people as Troy 6, though with noticeably fewer resources and more rudimentary architecture, as if the city were in a state of decline, under duress, or bracing for a prolonged siege. Nevertheless, a complete alignment with Homer's poetic description remains elusive. No trace of a wooden horse, no mention of specific royal names in discovered inscriptions, and no conclusive evidence directly linking the city's downfall to the Achaeans has yet been uncovered by archaeology. The historical Troy was, in all likelihood, a pivotal city at the crossroads of two worlds, the Aegean and Anatolian, a crucial hub on trade routes, and quite possibly an object of territorial and economic ambitions for powerful Mycenaean states. Archaeological data incontrovertibly confirms that this entire region, towards the close of the Bronze Age, underwent a period of profound upheaval, political, military, and economic. In poetic tradition, the genesis of the Trojan War is intertwined with an ancient myth involving not only mortal heroes, but also the Olympian gods themselves. The tale begins at the lavish wedding feast of King Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, to which all the immortals were invited save for Eris, the goddess of discord. Offended by this oversight, she appeared at the celebration uninvited and cast upon the table a golden apple bearing the terse inscription, "To the fairest." This audacious act immediately ignited a fierce dispute among three powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. To avert open conflict on Mount Olympus, the gods entrusted the resolution of the quarrel to a mortal, Paris, son of Priam, the Trojan king. Each of the goddesses sought to sway the youth to her side, dangling an unheard-of reward in return. Hera, Zeus's queen, promised him dominion over countless nations and boundless lands. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, pledged him the glory of an invincible warrior and unparalleled wisdom in matters of statecraft. Aphrodite, goddess of love, offered him the affections of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris bestowed the apple of discord upon Aphrodite, thereby sealing his own fate and that of his people. In return, the goddess showed him the path to Helen, daughter of Zeus himself and wife of Menelaus, the Spartan king. According to legend, Paris arrived in Sparta under the guise of a diplomatic mission, was warmly welcomed, and then, exploiting his host's hospitality, absconded with Helen to Troy. Some versions of the myth claim she followed him of her own accord, captivated by his beauty, while others insist she was abducted by force. In any event, this act became the casus belli, the formal pretext for the mobilization of all Greek forces. While at first glance this story may seem merely a beautiful myth, at its heart lie profound and enduring notions of duty, moral choice, and world order. As noted by the distinguished mythologist Walter Burkert, ancient myths articulated, through the figures of gods and heroes, complex moral conflicts that were both comprehensible and pertinent to the society of their time. The goddesses in this narrative are not simply allegorical figures. They embody three fundamental principles: political power, Hera; military might and wisdom, Athena; and personal affections and dynastic alliances, Aphrodite. For a ruler of the late Bronze Age, all three of these facets constituted the bedrock of their political existence. Paris, by choosing love, deliberately spurned the power and responsibility inherent in a ruler. His choice shattered the delicate equilibrium among the forces upon which a state rests, and it was this very breach that ultimately led to catastrophic war. Helen, in this narrative, plays a far more significant role than merely that of a beautiful woman. She was a living bond, forging a link between two kingdoms. Marriage to her was not only a personal union, but also a crucial political act, cementing loyalty and alliance. The breach of such an alliance constituted a direct challenge, flung at the entire political order of the Achaean world. This is precisely why a wronged Menelaus sought the backing of other Greek rulers. Their response to this violation of treaty and oaths coalesced into a joint expedition. In the epic, this event is framed as noble vengeance for desecrated honor, yet within the deeper fabric of the myth, one clearly discerns the concept of collective retribution for the violation of a sacred covenant, an act that could not and should not go unpunished. Within the poetic canon, preparations for the expedition involved summoning the greatest kings and heroes from across Greece. Agamemnon, the mighty ruler of Mycenae and Menelaus's elder brother, played a central role in this undertaking. It was he who became the supreme commander of the united coalition. The wily Odysseus, king of Ithaca, also participated in the muster of the army, as did other celebrated heroes, the peerless warrior Achilles, the formidable Ajax, and the wise elder Nestor. Each answered the call not merely as a friend of Menelaus, but as an ally in a shared cause concerning the honor and security of the entirety of Greek lands. This underscores the conflict's scale from its very inception. It swiftly escalated from a personal slight into a nationwide endeavor. To grasp why Troy found itself at the heart of this magnificent poetic narrative, we must cast our gaze upon the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 13th century BCE. It was a complex world where the interests of powerful empires intertwined. To the west lay the Mycenaean civilization, a network of well-organized palace states unified by a shared culture, a linear writing system, and bustling maritime trade. Their ambitious eyes, hungry for new riches, increasingly turned eastward, where beyond a narrow strait lay the key to Asia's untold treasures. The Achaeans, as these peoples are commonly known in modern scholarship, were the architects of a highly developed civilization. They constructed impregnable stone fortresses, possessed a centralized administrative system, and maintained vibrant trade links with distant regions of the East, including prosperous centers like Cyprus, Syria, and even mighty Egypt. Their ships plied the seas, delivering goods, ideas, and cultural influences, making the Mycenaean world a significant player on the international stage. To the east, across the vast expanses of the Anatolian Peninsula, stretched the mighty Hittite Empire. This was a formidable power with a sophisticated written bureaucracy, an impressive, well-organized army, and a sprawling network of vassal city-states that paid tribute and supplied warriors. The influence of the Hittite kings extended across central Anatolia and encompassed a significant portion of northern Syria, making them direct rivals of Egypt for regional hegemony. It was precisely between these two titans, at the strategic crossroads of civilizations, that the city we know as Troy stood, a coveted prize whose destiny, it seemed, was predetermined by its very location. At the geopolitical intersection between the powerful Hittite Empire and the conglomerate of Mycenaean kingdoms lay the coastal region of the Troad. It is here, as archaeological investigations show, that the legendary fortified city, which historians identify with Troy, was located. This borderland position sealed its fate, inevitably drawing it into the maelstrom of international politics of the era. In Hittite cuneiform documents, this city is referred to as Wilusa, and its strategic importance could hardly be overstated. It guarded the very entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, the maritime gateway that opened the path from the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara and beyond, to the boundless resources of the Black Sea region. This aquatic artery was a vitally important trade route, through which metals, grain, and valuable timber from the north flowed into the Aegean and Anatolian worlds. Controlling this narrow passage effectively granted power over a significant share of international commerce, transforming Troy into a highly coveted asset and a pivotal player on the political map. In such circumstances, the city simply could not remain neutral. Its loyalty, military alliances, trade agreements, and even the marital ties of its ruling dynasty became subjects of intense scrutiny and constant pressure from larger powers. Archaeology paints a picture of a prosperous and powerfully fortified center in the 13th century BCE. Imposing walls, constructed from colossal stone blocks, sophisticated water collection and storage systems, numerous auxiliary buildings, and unearthed artifacts all attest to a high degree of urban organization. Yet for all this, Troy's material culture markedly differed from Mycenaean. Here were distinct architectural traditions, different pottery, and its own local burial customs. All of this indicates that Troy, while in continuous dialogue with the Aegean world, culturally belonged to the Anatolian sphere. We can glean insights into the nature of the relationship between Troy and the Mycenaeans from invaluable information preserved in Hittite state archives. Diplomatic correspondence from the capital of Hattusa repeatedly mentions the land of Ahiawa, which most likely refers to an alliance of Greek kingdoms and its complex relations with Wilusa. These texts record territorial disputes, dynastic marriages, military interventions, and attempts by Hittite kings to mediate conflicts. Thus, we see that the confrontation between the Greek and Anatolian worlds in this region was a harsh reality long before epic poetry sang its praises. And although excavations have not yet provided direct evidence confirming a single, massive, and destructive war, the overall picture of the late 13th century BCE is rife with signs of escalating tension. Having outlined this political stage, we can now turn to the figures who became immortal heroes in the epic tradition. The legends of Troy are inconceivable without names that form the bedrock of ancient Greek cultural memory, and one of the central places among them belongs to Achilles, the embodiment of notions of valor, honor, and eternal glory. His image transcends that of a mere mythological character, representing the quintessential heroic ideal. Tradition holds that Achilles was the offspring of a union between the mortal king Peleus, ruler of Phthia in northern Greece, and the sea goddess Thetis. He emerged from an environment that modern researchers confidently link to the Thessalian military aristocracy. This assumption is supported by archaeology. Finds in Thessaly, including around modern-day Pharsalia, confirm the existence in the 13th century BCE of fortified centers that produced bronze weaponry and maintained close contacts with Mycenae. Such an environment was fertile ground for the birth of tales about great warriors whose exploits gradually became enshrouded in myth. The young hero's mentor was the centaur Chiron, a legendary being where the raw, untamed power of nature met the profoundest human wisdom. This symbolizes a core ancient ideal, the vital synergy between untamed martial ferocity and unwavering inner discipline. Chiron trained Achilles not just in the deadly arts of combat and the hunt, but also in medicine and music, a multifaceted education that in the epic tradition elevated his stature to an almost superhuman level. As centuries unfolded, the hero's saga swelled with new embellishments, none more iconic than the tale of his invulnerability. In later retellings of the myth, Thetis, determined to render her son immortal, immersed him in the hallowed dark waters of the underworld's river Styx. Every inch of his body became impervious to harm, save for the heel, the very spot where she held the infant. Crucially, this narrative arc is entirely absent from Homer's Iliad, where Achilles is portrayed as the greatest yet undeniably mortal warrior. Nevertheless, the enduring image of the Achilles heel has indelibly etched itself into global consciousness, serving as a universal metaphor for the critical, concealed weakness within even the most seemingly invincible. Historians, of course, possess no evidence of a historical figure bearing the name Achilles. Yet the hero's very archetype absorbed the distinctive hallmarks of the elite warrior culture prevalent during the late Bronze Age. Scholars like Moses Finley and Walter Burkett observed that Achilles' persona might have amalgamated the attributes and heroic deeds of actual chieftains and warlords, whose renown, passed down through oral tradition, gradually became mythologized and imbued with profound symbolic meaning. But the pivotal axis around which his epic character revolves is not mere physical prowess, but rather a profound, tragic choice between destiny and glory. As the poem recounts, this stark revelation comes to the hero from his divine mother. Thetis discloses to her son that joining the Trojan expedition will undeniably lead to his premature demise, but in return it will grant him everlasting renown, a legacy that will echo through the ages for thousands of years. This momentous foretold choice between a long-forgotten life and a brief yet dazzling blaze of glory became the moral lodestar that steered the entire epic toward its poignant and magnificent climax. Should he opt instead to return to his ancestral home, a long and tranquil life awaited him, yet his name would be condemned to utter oblivion. From the vantage point of that heroic age's values, such a decision was not perceived as a personal tragedy. Quite the opposite. It was seen as the triumphant embodiment of the highest ideal. In a world where human memory persisted solely through the verses of bards and ritualistic performances, posthumous glory was nothing less than a form of immortality. This theme resonates far beyond Greek culture. We discover parallel ideas in ancient texts of the Hittite Empire and even within the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, where heroic action emerges as the sole pathway to an eternal existence within the collective memory of posterity. Achilles holds no formal command position within the Achaean forces. He operates as an independent power, formally part of the allied army, yet his undeniable authority springs exclusively from his formidable martial prowess, the unwavering loyalty of his personal retinue, and his thunderous reputation. His persona perfectly aligns with the paradigm of a war chieftain whose power derives from sheer personal valor rather than any administrative rank. To the military psyche of the Mycenaean epoch, such a decentralized structure was entirely organic. Even amidst vast military campaigns, each individual king commander retained considerable autonomy. His weaponry, shield, helmet, spear, and cuirass, are transformed by Homer's poetic genius into objects of almost sacred, divine significance. With particular reverence and exquisite detail, the poet describes the shield, forged for the hero by the very god of smiths, Hephaestus himself. Upon its surface, an entire cosmos unfolds, scenes of peaceful life and bloody siege, tableaus of harvest and justice, wedding dances and funeral laments. This shield becomes a distilled microcosm of the entire universe, within which the hero is fated to act and ultimately to fall. Following the majestic figure of Achilles, it is imperative to turn our attention to those who embodied an entirely different type of influence during the Trojan expedition. Agamemnon and Menelaus operated within a framework of power rooted not in untamed fury or raw personal might, but in the exalted standing of a reigning dynasty and a complex political structure. Their roles in myth and culture reflect the late Bronze Age's understanding of monarchical authority and its operational mechanisms within a fragile, intertribal coalition. The figures of the Atreides brothers occupy a central position in epic tradition, shaping listeners' and readers' perceptions of power, family honor, and leadership principles in that distant era. Though both brothers are presented in the Iliad as potent rulers and commanders, their functions within the narrative and the cultural consciousness diverge significantly. One serves as the formal supreme commander, the other as the personal instigator of the entire conflict. In Homer's epic, Agamemnon is the paramount chieftain of the united Achaean army. His authority extends not only over his native Mycenae, but also over all the forces assembled beneath Troy's walls. The famed catalogue of ships embedded within the Iliad underscores that he personally led 100 ships, an unprecedented fleet demonstrating the sheer might of his kingdom. His status precisely mirrors the Mycenaean model of power, a formidable palace-centered state controlling immense resources, a potent army, and a vast network of dependent settlements. Archaeological evidence fully corroborates this portrayal. By the close of the Bronze Age, Mycenae was indeed one of the wealthiest and most influential centers in the entire Aegean world. The palace perched on an impregnable hill, encircled by cyclopean walls, vast storerooms brimming with provisions, royal tombs overflowing with precious weaponry and golden treasures, all bear witness to the existence of a complex and centralized state system. A ruler of the magnitude depicted as Agamemnon perfectly aligns with the historical realities of the Mycenaean world. Yet, within the poem itself, Agamemnon lacks the charisma of a true leader. His authority is more political, more formal. He dictates who receives rewards and who loses spoils. He commands collective resources and issues orders. But his authority is far from absolute. Other kings boldly dispute his decisions, and his famous quarrel with Achilles vividly illustrates the autonomy enjoyed by individual chieftains within the Greek military alliance. Their conflict erupts over the distribution of wartime plunder. Agamemnon, compelled to return one of his captives, demands as compensation a trophy rightfully belonging to Achilles. This act is perceived as a grave violation of warrior ethics, where personal merit and valor were prized above formal rank. The scene of their quarrel underscores that power in the expedition rested on a delicate balance of influence, rather than on unquestioning obedience. Menelaus, Agamemnon's brother and ruler of Sparta, is portrayed in the epic as more restrained and less domineering, yet he holds a direct personal stake in this war, for his wife Helen was abducted and carried off to Troy. In Homer's narrative, Menelaus is not the supreme commander, but rather a pivotal participant, for whom the war is a means to reclaim his personal honor and rectify grievous wrongs. His character enriches our understanding of the Mycenaean cultural world, where dynastic marriage was seen as a paramount political alliance, and its violation demanded immediate and resolute military retribution. One of the key episodes preceding the war is the feast scene in Sparta. The Trojan prince Paris, on a diplomatic visit, is a guest at a lavish banquet in Menelaus's home. The poet paints a picture of untold opulence, golden tableware, a multitude of servants, an abundance of delicacies, and an enormous palace. However, this episode, conveying a later conception of royal luxury, diverges from archaeological evidence. 13th century BCE Sparta was a rather modest settlement, albeit with a clear Mycenaean presence. No traces of palaces akin to those in Mycenae have been discovered in the area. Thus, the glittering description of the Spartan court in the poem most likely reflects archaic or even classical ideas of kingship superimposed upon an ancient narrative. This prompts a compelling question. If even the depiction of the hero's material world underwent such a transformation, how profoundly might their true motivations and the very essence of their actions have changed over centuries of oral transmission? A Sparta of such grandeur was, most likely, an invention retroactively imagined to lend its legendary rulers more dignity and to align with the epic scale of events. In the archaeological context, late Bronze Age Sparta has been studied considerably less than Mycenae. The site of the future great city-state consisted of scattered settlements that fell within the influence of Laconia. Nevertheless, an undeniable Mycenaean presence in the region is corroborated by numerous finds of characteristic pottery, bronze artifacts, and even remnants of structures that could be attributed to palatial architecture. This provides strong grounds to believe that the figure of Menelaus may have had a genuine historical basis, even if his portrayal in the epic is less detailed than that of his mighty brother. It is fascinating to trace how, in later classical tradition, particularly in Greek drama, the figure of Agamemnon underwent a significant transformation. He became the embodiment of tragic power, shouldering the burden of agonizing decisions and the fatal inevitability of conflict. He was no longer merely a general, but a figure compelled to make profound personal sacrifices for the greater good. Menelaus, in contrast, remained a more intimate, almost familial character, reflecting themes of personal affront, dynastic obligation, and the desperate quest to reclaim what was lost. A hero of an entirely different mold, as narrated by the epic sources, was Odysseus, the ingenious ruler of the island of Ithaca. His renown was built less on the brute force of his weapon and more on his sharp intellect, his gift for eloquence, and his knack for innovative problem-solving. In the Trojan cycle, he plays a pivotal, though not always conspicuous role as advisor, diplomat, and strategist. His influence palpable throughout the war and even after its conclusion. In the Iliad, Odysseus fights alongside everyone else and participates in war councils, yet he is not among those warriors whose valor shines in furious duels like Achilles or Ajax. His primary gifts are persuasive speech, strategic thinking, and a unique ability to resolve conflicts. It is precisely he who is dispatched to Achilles when the latter, in a furious rage, refuses to enter the battlefield. This occurs after a humiliating quarrel with Agamemnon, when the supreme chieftain of the Achaeans seizes Achilles' war prize, a captive named Briseis. For Achilles, this constitutes an unbearable personal insult, an assault on his honor and status. He abandons the Achaean camp, and his refusal to fight jeopardizes the entire military campaign. Amidst this crisis, it is Odysseus who leads the embassy sent to the greatest of warriors, pleading for his return. This scene fully reveals the immense trust he commanded. He was considered the one person capable of finding the right words, even for someone consumed by righteous fury and mortal grievance. The island of Ithaca, which Odysseus ruled, was situated on the western fringe of the Aegean world. In the late Bronze Age, it was a remote, yet by no means isolated territory, part of the broader sphere of Mycenaean cultural and political influence. Archaeological excavations in the Stavros area of modern Ithaca have uncovered Mycenaean pottery and traces of 13th century BCE settlements. And while full-fledged palatial complexes have not been found here, the existence of some center of authority, however modest in scale, leaves no doubt among scholars. This confirms that the figure of Odysseus, as the ruler of a small but independent kingdom, could have had a genuine historical basis. A distinctive feature of his character lies in his perpetual juxtaposition against leaders with vastly superior resources. He yields to Agamemnon in the breadth of his dominion and to Achilles in sheer physical might. Yet, he emerges as the irreplaceable linchpin when brute force or formal authority falter and hit a dead end. His celebrated cunning in the Greek tradition signifies not treachery or deception, but rather profound wisdom, a capacity to perceive deeper truths, to act with agility, and to achieve his objectives amidst the most intricate and bewildering circumstances. Within the epic, Odysseus also serves as the architect of pivotal decisions that profoundly reshape the trajectory of events. He is instrumental in planning the Trojan Horse stratagem, spearheads critical reconnaissance missions, and plays a pivotal role in formulating the overall siege strategy. Across the poems within the epic cycle, he is depicted as the one who steadfastly urges the continuation of the war when others are poised to concede defeat. His voice carries profound weight, not because of formal rank, but by virtue of his towering intellectual authority. The Little Iliad and other poems in the cycle recount that it was Odysseus who conceived the idea of using the colossal wooden horse as a ruse to breach the impregnable defenses of Troy. He personally selected the most valorous warriors, concealing them within the deadly contrivance, then orchestrated the feigned retreat of the Achaean fleet to cunningly lull the Trojans into a perilous complacency. Later, as the Greeks finally seize the city, Odysseus acts with unyielding resolve and without a flicker of hesitation. He takes part in the conflagration of Troy, relentlessly pursues the remaining defenders, and seizes sacred statues of the gods and invaluable relics. These grim scenes only intensify the portrait of a man capable of prosecuting any plan to its ultimate conclusion, no matter how brutal the means. Following the devastation of Troy, Odysseus ascends to become the central figure of a distinct and monumental epic, the Odyssey, chronicling his prolonged and harrowing journey home. This segment of the epic tradition portrays him as a solitary combatant, now detached from the army and the coalition, battling fiercely for his right to reclaim his home. Yet, both in the Iliad and across the other poems of the cycle, he endures as the pivotal figure around whom compromises crystallize, brilliant strategies are forged, and the most audacious and unexpected decisions are rendered. His enduring role underscores a fundamental truth. Warfare is not merely about weaponry and valor, but equally about intellect and the intricate art of navigation through a world where order and justice can be shattered at any given moment. Having explored the Achaean heroes, it is only fitting to now turn our attention to the opposing side, the very people they laid siege to for 10 long years. And among the Trojans, the most significant and tragically compelling figure, without a shadow of a doubt, is Hector, a valiant warrior, a devoted father, and the rightful heir to the Trojan throne. Unlike many of the Greek heroes, Hector's actions are invariably aligned with his societal standing, his rank within the army, and his sacred obligations towards his family and his beloved city. From the very outset, it was fatefully decreed that the trajectories of these two worlds, personified by their most formidable heroes, were destined to collide at an irreversible point of no return. It was he who stood as the unyielding bastion upon which the entire defense of besieged Troy depended. This stature was earned not merely by birthright, but by his persistent and proactive engagement in the battle's direst moments, coupled with his unwavering readiness to shoulder the full, crushing weight of responsibility for the destiny of his people. Within Homer's immortal epic, Hector is depicted as the supreme commander of the combined forces of the Trojans and their allies. Yet, his leadership is fundamentally distinct from Agamemnon's formal authority. He does not merely issue commands from behind the city's impenetrable walls, but personally leads his warriors into the fray, embodying an unwavering beacon of courage and self-sacrifice. Thus, the destiny of an entire people rested upon the shoulders of one man, and this immense burden simultaneously became both his greatest strength and his unspoken curse. Hector is introduced as the firstborn son of King Priam, the husband of Andromache and the father of young Astyanax. This intricate web of familial bonds irrevocably shapes his destiny. He emerges as Troy's paramount protector, accepting the full, crushing weight of commanding the besieged city's defense. Every one of his actions on the battlefield is driven not by personal ambition, but by a profound awareness of his responsibility to his loved ones, his people, and history itself. In this regard, he stands as the complete antithesis of Achilles, for whom war is merely a conduit to eternal glory and immortality in the collective memory of generations. Hector's priorities are fundamentally different. His thoughts and deeds are entirely dedicated to the survival of his native polis. His mission is not to garner resounding fame, but to preserve the walls of Troy and to shield everyone who seeks refuge behind them. This burden of responsibility does not transform him into a soulless war machine. On the contrary, the most poignant moments of the epic, his farewell dialogues with Andromache and their son, lay bare his profound humanity. In his words, the intertwining threads of anxiety for their future, the tenderness of a loving husband and father, and an unwavering readiness to accept his fate are evident. The Homeric tradition elevates such conduct to the pinnacle of valor. True courage here lies not in the pursuit of accolades or renown, but in adhering to an internal compass of duty, even when it demands the ultimate sacrifices. His leadership was not a detached command from royal chambers. Hector was the very heart and soul of the Trojan defense, positioned directly on the front lines. He was not a passive symbol of authority, but a living exemplar for his warriors, whose personal presence in the very crucible of battle infused them with courage. It was Hector who spearheaded attacks, driving back the enemy to the very Achaean ships, coordinated the actions of allied contingents, organized the defense of vulnerable gates, and fought shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers. Despite the fact that Trojan history did not give rise to an epic cycle as expansive as the Achaean one, the figure of Hector has carved out its own enduring legacy in culture. What is particularly striking is that even his Greek adversaries held him in genuine respect. In later tragedies, Roman poetry, and philosophical treatises, he transformed into the archetype of the noble warrior who, until his very last breath, maintained unwavering loyalty to his duty and upheld his human dignity. And while no direct evidence of a historical Hector has been uncovered, archaeological excavations provide a compelling backdrop for such a figure. Excavations at the presumed site of Troy, within cultural layers dated to the close of the 13th century before the Common Era, have revealed formidable fortress walls, towering watchtowers, and clear signs of fierce battles and widespread destruction. All of this points to the existence of a highly organized military system, the management of which would have required a leader of the highest caliber. It is entirely plausible that such a military commander indeed existed, albeit perhaps under a different name. The epic tradition, however, concentrated within Hector's image all the qualities of an ideal leader upon whom not only military, but also the highest moral obligations were bestowed. The formal catalyst for the conflict that drew dozens of kingdoms across the Aegean region into its vortex was the union of the Trojan prince Paris and the Spartan queen Helen. However, beneath this romantic narrative lay far deeper political and cultural realities of the late Bronze Age. Paris, a Trojan prince who grew up far from court only to later return to his family, represents a unique kind of hero. He possesses royal lineage, yet his primary tools are not the sword and spear, but rather personal charm and irresistible beauty. In a world where status was typically defined by martial valor, Paris operated by an entirely different set of rules, making him a figure who transcended the customary heroic canon. Helen, whose lineage traced back to Leda herself, and according to legend to Zeus, was from a tender age not merely a beauty, but a most valuable political asset. Her marriage to Menelaus, the king of Sparta, served as a cornerstone, cementing the alliance between his house and other powerful Achaean dynasties. In that era, dynastic marriages were the primary instrument of diplomacy. Through them, treaties were forged, spheres of influence demarcated, and enduring alliances established. Therefore, when Helen abandoned Sparta for Troy, it was perceived not as a personal drama, but as an act that shattered the established world order. Her disappearance severed a crucial thread that bound the Achaean kingdoms, becoming a direct geopolitical provocation demanding a swift and decisive response. The multifaceted nature of her character is reflected in the divergent interpretations offered by ancient authors. In the Iliad, she appears as a contemplative figure, tormented by guilt. In Euripides' tragedies, she is a woman undergoing profound inner torment. And in Isocrates' rhetorical treatise, In Praise of Helen, she is entirely transformed into an idealized divine gift whose sheer magnificence justifies any upheaval. Paris himself, being neither a great warrior nor a strategist, fulfills a different yet equally vital function in the epic. He is a catalyst for global change. His personal choice dramatically illustrates how, in the ancient mindset, a private action by one individual could precipitate a tectonic shift in the destinies of entire nations. Finally, at the heart of the Trojan world stands the figure of the aged King Priam, the ruler under whom the city faced the greatest trial in its history. In the epic narratives, his position rests not so much on strength as on wisdom, profound life experience, and unquestionable authority. Priam's power is the power of counsel, measured advice, and prudent governance, especially invaluable in the harsh realities of a multi-year siege, when his very presence served as a moral bedrock for the entirety of Trojan society. The fates of the protector, the seducer, the beauty, and the sage became intertwined in a single Gordian knot, which only the sword of war could sever. Amidst the chaos of military operations, the elderly king does not withdraw from governing Troy. On the contrary, he becomes its central administrative hub. His court transforms into the nerve center of the besieged city, where envoys from allies are received, war councils are convened, and the constantly shifting situation on the fortress walls is analyzed. Through continuous dialogue with Hector, he maintains control over internal processes, preventing the city from descending into anarchy. The image of Priam is that of a ruler who remains at his post until his very last breath, serving as a living symbol of unyielding Trojan statehood. The pinnacle of his paternal and regal valor unfolds in one of the most poignant episodes of the Iliad. After Hector falls at the hand of Achilles, Priam, leaving the security of the city walls behind, dares the unimaginable, a solitary visit to the enemy camp to beg for the body of his beloved son. Bearing rich gifts loaded onto a wagon, he undertakes this fatally perilous journey alone. In his address to Achilles, there resounds not only the plea of a father shattered by grief, but also the unyielding dignity of a monarch. These words resonate deeply within the Achaean hero's soul, stirring memories of his own father, Peleus, and the fierce tension between them gives way to profound human respect. This episode proves that Priam's true strength lies not in weaponry, but in his ability to influence people through the power of his words and his inherent nobility. According to epic tradition, before the Achaean fleet set sail for the shores of Troy, their leaders gathered in the port of Aulis. It was there that one of the most tragic narratives of the entire pre-war cycle unfolded: the ritual sacrifice of Iphigenia. The colossal fleet was ready to depart, but the ships found themselves trapped by a relentless calm, which the priests interpreted as the wrath of the goddess Artemis. Agamemnon, the supreme commander of the expedition, was informed that only a sacrifice could appease the goddess, and this sacrifice had to be his own daughter. This story, absent from the Iliad but elaborately developed by later authors, notably Euripides in his tragedy Iphigenia at Aulis, exists in two versions. In one, Iphigenia is indeed sacrificed. In the other, at the very last moment, Artemis replaces the maiden with a deer and carries her away. Both endings serve not so much as a chronicle of a real event as a philosophical parable about the insoluble conflict between religious fanaticism, political expediency, and the intensely personal tragedy of a father. The historical roots of this narrative likely stretch back to actual ritual practices performed before significant undertakings. For late Bronze Age civilizations, such ceremonies were far from uncommon. Archaeological discoveries at Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns bear witness to rituals conducted before military campaigns or the construction of major fortifications, during which animals, most often oxen, sheep, or swine, were sacrificed. While direct evidence of human sacrifice remains exceedingly scarce, in a culture where the success of an undertaking was directly entwined with divine will, such myths might have emerged as a hyperbolized echo of existing customs. The very act of such a sacrifice underscored the colossal scale of the expedition, demanding from its leaders not only military cohesion, but also supreme personal resolve. Upon disembarking on the coast of the Troad, the Achaeans faced the necessity of a protracted siege. In the realities of that age, this didn't imply continuous assaults, but rather a grueling succession of skirmishes, the torching of outlying villages, raiding for plunder, and blockades of supply routes. Fortresses, if assaulted, were attacked using scaling ladders, battering rams, and sapping tunnels, but more often than not, cities were taken by attrition, their resources depleted over many months, and sometimes even years. On the battlefield, chariots reigned supreme, bearing kings and the most noble warriors, followed by heavily armored infantry. Their primary weapons were spears, javelins, and short bronze swords. Defense was provided by large wooden shields sheathed in hide and bronze armor, much like the renowned Dendra panoply, which entirely encased the warrior's torso and shoulders. Such armor was accessible only to the highest aristocracy, as were the famous boar's tusk helmets. Fragments unearthed by archaeologists corroborate the accuracy of Homer's descriptions. These helmets served not only a protective function, but also a ritualistic one, emphasizing the warrior's elevated status. After several grueling years of siege, the narrative shifts its focus. The spotlight moves from clashes of armies to the personal choices, duels, and tragedies of individual heroes. Now, the destinies of entire peoples were no longer decided by troop maneuvers, but by the force of wrath, the depths of sorrow, and the thirst for vengeance residing in the hearts of a handful of mortals. It is precisely these personal dramas that imbue the epic poem with its profound dramatic tension, mirroring the Mycenaean perception of war as a chain of individual acts, each carrying fateful consequences for entire nations. The first such turning point comes with the duel between Menelaus, the Spartan king, and Paris, the Trojan prince. As the opposing armies prepare to clash, Paris steps forward, striking a dramatic pose before the Achaean host. However, at the sight of Menelaus, who advances toward him weapon in hand, the prince cravenly retreats into the ranks of his countrymen. Hector immediately and publicly rebukes his brother for such ignoble conduct, demanding that he prove his readiness to accept responsibility for his choice. Under the weight of these accusations, Paris proposes to settle Helen's fate through single combat. The victor would claim the woman and her opulent dowry, and the war would cease then and there. Both sides accept this proposition, and the full-scale battle is postponed. After the priests perform the ritual slaying of 2 lambs and the chieftains offer sacred vows to the gods, the armies disperse, clearing the field for the duel. Paris, having donned his armor and taken up his bow and sword, is the first to loose an arrow, but it merely deflects harmlessly off Menelaus's shield. A fierce hand-to-hand combat ensues. Menelaus manages to wound Paris with his spear, then grabs him by his helmet and drags him toward his own lines, anticipating triumph. Yet, at the very moment when victory seems assured, Paris mysteriously vanishes from the battlefield. According to the epic, he is saved and whisked away to her chambers by the goddess Aphrodite herself. The fragile truce is shattered, and the war erupts with renewed fury. The very concept of such a duel as a legitimate method of conflict resolution is deeply embedded in ancient tradition. A historical precedent exists where a dispute over border territories between Sparta and Argos was resolved by a combat between the 3 finest warriors from each camp. This approach allowed for the avoidance of widespread bloodshed and preserved the honor of both parties. The duel between Paris and Menelaus follows the same logic. Matters of honor, dynastic marriage, and alliance obligations could be resolved through a ritualistic combat between the 2 principal figures. The next pivotal episode, altering the course of the war, is the death of Patroclus. Humiliated by Agamemnon, Achilles pointedly refuses to engage in combat. But as the Trojans close in on the Achaean ships, threatening to burn the entire fleet, his dearest friend Patroclus pleads to be allowed to don Achilles' armor and lead a counterattack. Achilles agrees, but imposes one condition. Patroclus must merely repel the enemy from the camp, and under no circumstances pursue them all the way to the walls of Troy. However, intoxicated by his initial success, Patroclus defies the prohibition. He sweeps the Myrmidon contingents with him, fiercely pursuing the retreating Trojans all the way to the city gates, where he confronts Hector. In the ensuing struggle, Patroclus perishes. The epic emphasizes that his death was predetermined by divine intervention. First, the god Apollo strikes him invisibly in the back, rendering him vulnerable. Then, the Trojan Euphorbus disarms him, and only after this does Hector deliver the decisive spear thrust. News of his friend's death plunges Achilles into a state of shock. He tears at his hair, covers his head with ash, and vows vengeance for Patroclus. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, appeals to the smith god Hephaestus, who forges a new set of armor for the hero, which would become one of the most renowned in world literature. Achilles' shield depicts not merely battle scenes, but an entire cosmos. Cities in times of peace and war, the starry heavens, vignettes of labor and celebration. Through this description, the epic conveys that the hero's impending vengeance will not simply be an act of retribution, but an event of cosmic proportions, disrupting the entire established order of things. Thereafter, a transformed Achilles steps onto the battlefield, becoming an unstoppable force of destruction. At this juncture, the Iliad introduces the famous mythological episode of the hero's struggle with the river Scamander. The river's current, swollen with the bodies of slain Trojans, rises up against Achilles, overflows its banks, and attempts to engulf him. This scene symbolizes that the hero's fury has grown so monstrous that nature itself rebels against it. Finally, the decisive duel with Hector arrives. The Trojan commander accepts the challenge, stepping outside the city walls, knowing he will most likely not return alive. Achilles triumphs, piercing Hector through the neck with his spear. The dying hero makes a final plea to his killer, to return his body to his family for a proper burial. But Achilles, blinded by grief and a thirst for revenge, refuses him. This refusal is the extreme point of his savagery, beyond which moral awakening and a return to human norms must follow. After the battle, Achilles commits an act of ultimate humiliation. Tying Hector's body to his chariot, he drags his fallen foe through the dust 3 times around the walls of Troy. Yet, it is precisely this sacrilege that becomes the turning point. Later, upon meeting Hector's father, old King Priam, Achilles finally gains insight. He returns the body, agrees to a truce, and allows the Trojans to bury their hero, for by the unwritten laws of the Greek world, even the bitterest enemy had a right to burial. This return to humanity, occurring amidst the ashes of the greatest battle, became the true, though tragic, conclusion of his personal war. Even after Hector, the main pillar of Troy, had fallen, the war did not end. Achilles, his thirst for vengeance slaked, remained in the Achaean camp and continued to participate in battles. In the crucial engagements, it was he, as the undisputed leader, who led the Greek army to the very walls of the impregnable city. His fury and valor still struck terror into the hearts of his enemies and instilled hope in the souls of his comrades. However, fate decreed that the greatest of heroes would not witness the triumph for which he had sacrificed everything. He did not live to see the final Achaean victory, to the day when flames would consume proud Troy. Was his path to immortal glory complete, or did he fall victim to the very destiny he so desperately tried to transcend? Soon after his decisive triumph in battle, the greatest of the Achaean warriors met his end. The legend, most firmly rooted throughout the ages, holds that a fatal arrow, shot by the Trojan prince Paris, sealed his doom. The tradition vividly paints this scene. Paris acted not in open combat, but from cover, perhaps from the wall of the besieged city, and his actions were invisibly guided by the god Apollo himself, who directed the deadly flight of the arrow to the hero's only vulnerable spot, his heel. This part of the body, as the ancients believed, remained unprotected when his mother immersed him in infancy in the sacred waters of the underworld river Styx, which granted invulnerability. This motif can be traced back to the earliest, archaic retellings of the myth, and by the era of late antiquity, it transformed into a central symbol explaining the fall of the invincible. It is noteworthy, however, that the Iliad itself remains silent about this event. Homer's poem concludes with the description of Hector's funeral rites, leaving the account of Achilles' death to later songs of the extensive epic cycle. Earlier sources merely state that he sustained a mortal arrow wound, which, in the context of the heroic culture of that era, was considered an inglorious death, unworthy of a warrior who had known no defeat in fair combat. The hero, unbroken in countless skirmishes, fell at the moment when victory in the prolonged war seemed so close. After his demise, the Greeks fought fiercely to recover the body of their fallen comrade and arranged a lavish funeral. On a massive pyre erected on the seashore, his armor, weapons, precious gifts, war horses, and, according to grim tradition, captured Trojan youths were burned, sacrificed to his shade. The warrior's ashes were collected in a precious urn, which, according to later authors, was placed in the same tomb as the ashes of his loyal friend Patroclus, thereby immortalizing their unbreakable bond. A tall barrow was raised over the burial site on the Hellespont's shore, directly opposite the walls of Troy, so it would be visible to ships passing by on the sea. However, Achilles' story did not end there. In the religious consciousness of the Hellenes, he transformed into an object of heroic cult. The historian Herodotus mentioned that the descendants of the Achaeans, especially sailors passing his tomb, offered sacrifices in his honor. An even more enduring and mystical tradition links his posthumous fate to the island of Luke, the White Island, located at the mouth of the Danube. According to the texts of Arrian and Strabo, the hero's body itself was transported there by the will of the gods through sea winds. Legend has it that on this island, the gods erected a shining temple for him, surrounded by a sacred grove where Achilles' immortal shade resided. Here, sacrifices were made in his honor, ritual foot races were held, and weapons and woven wreaths were left as offerings. The island was considered mysterious and difficult to access. Sailors who dared to approach its shores claimed to hear the sounds of a lyre or the mysterious footsteps of unseen beings from there. Later, Roman sources asserted that Patroclus also resided there, and at times other heroes of the Trojan War who found refuge there were mentioned as well. And so, the island of Leuce was transformed into a kind of heroic Elysium, a realm of eternal bliss for select souls existing beyond the bounds of time. Later Roman authors, among them Lucan and Philostratus, particularly stressed that it was here, not in the grim underworld, where Achilles found true immortality. Following his demise, the cunning Odysseus emerged as the central figure among the Achaeans. It is his name that ancient tradition inextricably links with the most renowned and symbolic episode of the entire Trojan War, the creation of the wooden horse. This image has become one of the most recognizable in all of Greek mythology, yet its historical basis remains a subject of fierce debate to this day. In the classical version of the myth, recounted in Homer's Odyssey and particularly amplified by Virgil's Aeneid, the Greeks, despairing of capturing Troy by force after a siege lasting 10 years, resort to a military ruse. They construct a colossal wooden figure of a horse, inside which they conceal a contingent of their finest warriors, then feign retreat, sailing their fleet beyond the horizon. Discovering the colossal horse at their gates, the Trojans decide it is a sacred offering to the goddess Athena, and despite warnings, haul it into the city. In the dead of night, the concealed warriors emerge, throw open the city gates, allowing the main Achaean forces, who had been lying in wait nearby, to pour into defenseless Troy, dooming it to destruction by fire and sword. From the vantage point of historical scholarship, this narrative raises a multitude of questions. Since the late 19th century, archaeologists and philologists have proposed several theories attempting to explain the true genesis of this myth. According to one such theory, a symbolic interpretation suggests that the wooden horse might have been a poetic descriptor for a siege engine. During the late Bronze Age, massive covered structures on wheels were indeed employed, allowing warriors to safely approach city walls to ignite gates or dismantle fortifications. It is entirely plausible that in the military lexicon of that era, the word horse could have denoted such a machine. Another, geophysical hypothesis posits that the horse represents a metaphorical depiction of a natural catastrophe. In Greek mythology, Poseidon was revered not only as the lord of the seas, but also as the god of earthquakes, and he was likewise considered the patron of horses. If the walls of Troy were indeed destroyed by a powerful subterranean tremor, then later poetic tradition could well have clothed this event in the imagery of a divine horse that brought the city to ruin. This theory finds indirect corroboration in archaeological data. Within the destruction layers of Troy 7, the city on Hisarlik Hill, dated to the 13th century BCE, evidence of severe collapses and fires has been unearthed. A third perspective, the politico-psychological theory, points to the possibility of treachery within the city, where, over the long years of siege, factions advocating for surrender might have emerged. Thus concluded the story of a city that fell not so much by the sword as by the weight of a single, fateful gift, the true nature of which will forever remain a subject of fervent debate. The theory of internal betrayal leading to the gates being opened is indirectly corroborated by archaeological data, which indicates that the city's assault was swift and accompanied by an all-consuming conflagration. In such a scenario, the legend of the wooden horse emerges as a plausible facade designed to conceal the true reason for the city's downfall, a deep rift within Trojan society. To the ancient mind, the notion that great Troy fell due to mere treachery might have been morally unacceptable, and thus this tragedy was framed as a clever military stratagem, sanctified by divine intervention. Another avenue of analysis delves into the religious undertones of this event. The horse was revered as a sacred animal by many peoples across the eastern Mediterranean and was inextricably linked with various cults of power and authority. It is not inconceivable that the Achaeans genuinely left a wooden effigy at the city walls as a ritualistic offering, shrewdly banking on the Trojans' superstitious reverence for such symbols. Accepting such a gift into the city could have been construed as a violation of some sacred taboo, which in itself would have invited catastrophe. The motif of an alien object accepted into the fold yet bearing ruin also resonates in several Near Eastern literary works. Finally, it is quite probable that the tale of the Trojan horse represents a later artistic interpretation of the very concept of military cunning, seamlessly integrated into the cycle of heroic myths. In ancient culture, Odysseus embodied not brute force, but sophisticated intellect and ingenuity. The emergence of the horse image in later stages of oral tradition vividly underscored this quality, setting him apart from heroes who prevailed solely through open combat. Thus, the myth itself may not be a reflection of a specific historical fact, but rather a brilliant literary device, solidified during the epoch when the history of the Trojan War finally crystallized into a canonical epic structure. It is likely impossible to definitively reconstruct the historical backdrop of this episode. However, the sheer fact that the city's destruction was sudden and accompanied by a grandiose fire strengthens the theory of an unforeseen enemy infiltration within its walls. Precisely how this occurred, whether through military stratagem, treachery, or even a natural disaster, remains an unanswered question. But the symbolic power of this image proved so immense that it transcended all historical interpretations, transforming into a universal emblem of cunning and victory achieved through intellect rather than might, forever etched into the cultural fabric of Europe. Troy's fall marked the end of the war, yet it was merely the prologue to the personal dramas of its famed participants. Their subsequent fates proved no less eventful and tragic than the 10-year siege itself. These post-war sagas weave a vast epic tapestry where mythological narratives reflect genuine historical shifts occurring in the region. For instance, Odysseus's protracted return to Ithaca, which, according to poetic tradition, spanned 10 years, is replete with symbols that, over time, came to be interpreted not literally, but as a metaphor for wanderings in a world where former foundations had crumbled. Each of his trials, be it the island of the nymph Calypso, the lands of cannibalistic giants, or the loss of loyal companions, could reflect genuine perils of seafaring during a period of dissolving old trade networks. Historians suggest that real knowledge of Greece's western coast, southern Italy, and the Adriatic waters was interwoven into his fictional route. No less tragic is the fate of Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae. Returning home a victor, he was treacherously murdered in his own palace. Myth directly links his demise to the sacrifice he once made. His daughter Iphigenia given to the gods for favorable winds for the expedition to Troy. However, later interpretations, particularly in Attic tragedy, see in this event the culmination of the collapse of patriarchal authority. The murder of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus is viewed as an internal palace coup, made possible by the weakening of the traditional governing system after the king's 10-year absence. This mythological tableau finds striking corroboration in historical data. Archaeological evidence points to a wave of destruction and fires in the largest Mycenaean centers around 1150 to 1130 BCE. After the fall of Troy, Mycenaean civilization never recovered from this blow. Syllabic script vanished, palace economies declined, and established trade routes with the East were severed. Over the subsequent 2 centuries, mainland Greece plunged into a period historians call the Dark Ages. Urban life stagnated, and the population began to migrate en masse. In this context, the tale of the Trojan War appears not merely as a heroic epic, but as a grand cultural allegory, preserving in the memory of generations a monumental civilizational turning point. The myth does not offer a direct account of specific events, but shapes an image of transition from a world of powerful kingdoms to an era of isolation, chaotic displacements, and the emergence of new social structures. The heroes who survived the conflagration of war, in the poetic logic of myth, turn out to be not triumphant victors, but exiles, condemned to wanderings, betrayal, and death. The myth preserved the names of the victors, but history itself was preparing to mercilessly erase the world they had left behind when they set off for war.